What makes land uninhabitable? Today we're discussing the topic, what makes land uninhabitable for you personally, and how to consider the present and potential future EMF environment before you buy. Coming up.
EMF Remedy is dedicated to helping you understand which electromagnetic threats are present in your home, and whether in the context of your current home, one you're considering for purchase, or building a new home with comprehensive protection designed in, EMF Remedy can help you reduce your family's exposure to harmful, man-made electromagnetic radiation.
Hi, this is Keith Cutter with EMFremedy.com, and you are listening to Reversing Electromagnetic Poisoning, and whether you want to take a precautionary approach towards the exposure of you and your loved ones to non-native EMF, or you know you've been poisoned, you are being poisoned, and you have a life priority of getting to the lowest EMF exposure possible, you're in the right place. And today we're going to be talking about the topic of what makes land uninhabitable. Let's start off with a definition. So according to the website for Cornell Law School, caveat emptor is a common law doctrine that places the burden on buyers to reasonably examine property before making a purchase. A buyer who fails to meet this burden is unable to recover for defects in the product that would have been discovered had this burden been met. The phrase caveat emptor is Latin for let the buyer beware. So, I believe that non-native EMF exposure is the single most significant environmental toxin in history, but whether or not you share that opinion, let's kind of talk about what does create an uninhabitable place. So when I say that, when I first said it, when I said uninhabitable land, what picture was in your mind? You know, I have this idea that we have certain slots, if you will, in our mind, and when we say certain pictures, like if I said Ferrari, right, what picture comes in your mind? If I say Ford, what picture comes in your mind? You probably have different associations with different words. When I say uninhabitable, what comes to mind for you? Where would you not be willing to live? And I think this is a great discussion. My wife and I first got into looking at this, I guess maybe 30 years ago, when we relocated from a horribly metropolitan place that we were living to a slower pace of life in the inland Northwest. And we had a number of things that we were concerned about, we considered. And for you, they may be different factors. They may include things like health. Certain people may want to be close to a hospital in case of an emergency, or their favorite doctor, or their massage therapist, or their chiropractor, or whatever you would put under the umbrella of health. Maybe your acupuncturist. Crime. Crime is a factor, right? Depending on where you live, you may have a higher crime rate and more probability of crime affecting your life, or other places may have a lower crime rate. And that's certainly something you might want to take into consideration. Likewise with the weather. We lived in a place that had close to 300 days a year once of sunshine. That was awfully nice. Employment, right? I mean, if it was the best place imaginable, but you couldn't work and you were not independently wealthy, you could say that land was uninhabitable, right, for you. Because how are you going to live there? Culturally, different people have different affinities for, the arts and whatnot. I believe non-native EMF exposure is the single most significant environmental toxin in history. And I think one of the primary reasons for that is because most people don't understand the health implications. And they end up exposing themselves and their loved ones without regard to the consequences. This, by the way, described me for most of my life, even though I was suffering for over 30 years from electromagnetic poisoning without being conscious of the fact of that poisoning. So, as I mentioned at the outset, if you're listening to this, you're either sensitive, which means you've made that correlation that took me 30 years to figure out, between exposure to non-native EMF and what's going on in your life from a health perspective. Or you're precautionary. You want to take a precautionary approach, which means you may be making a decision on behalf of not only yourself, but also your loved ones, your spouse, your children. And if that decision is yours, then you have that responsibility for those other lives as well. And you might just say, I'm not quite sure, but I want to take a precautionary approach. And what that really means is until and unless someday in the fullness of time, someone comes forward with reasonable research and conclusions that prove beyond a shadow of a doubt there is no harm, well, I'm not going to subject my family to this particular environmental toxin. That is the spirit of the precautionary approach. Now, there is a third type of person, the skeptic, and I can't help you. I know I can't help you because I couldn't be helped when I was in that 30-year period of suffering without any clue whatsoever what was causing the suffering. And I would have resisted anyone telling me that it could have been something invisible to me like EMF. That's why I know I can't help you. If you are a skeptic and you're an honest skeptic, maybe read a book. Maybe Body Electric by Becker or Wi-Fi Refugee by Rowan, or maybe Electronic Silent Spring by Singer. If you don't like reading books, fine. Maybe you like reading the scientific research directly. Hey, maybe take a look over at bioinitiative.org, and they have lots of research-based conclusions there. Anyway, assuming that you're either sensitive or precautionary, my message today is when you're considering a new place to live, you not only need to consider the current EMF profile, but you need to consider, is it likely to be strategic long-term? That's my opinion. You need to consider whether it's going to be strategic long-term. So people will tell me, look, I'm just going to buy a home in the country. Not enough. Not anymore. I have 3 examples coming up that I want to talk you through real life examples of things that I've encountered recently in my practice as an EMF consultant. And I think you'll see that even a beautiful place can have unacceptable levels of non-native EMF. So let me ask you a couple of questions as well. Before we get to those examples, when you're going to be buying a home, maybe you've heard of asbestos as something that you don't really want to have in your home. Do you do your own asbestos testing? What about if you have an awareness of lead and you're aware that the maximum permissible exposure level for lead for good health is 0? Do you do your own lead testing, for the soil and for the paint? Kids are going to be playing in the soil, right? In the lawn, in the backyard. How about arsenic and farm chemicals? So let me choose just that last one to kind of drill down on. In the county in which I live, which is a swell place, it's becoming more toxic from an EMF perspective because the city government and the county government seem to have no clue about the toxic nature of EMF. But there are relatively few people and a lot of land. So if you're careful about where you choose to live, you can solve a lot of the EMF problems with distance. But we have some challenges here with our water, challenges that a lot of people are not aware of. For example, there are places in this county where they have arsenic in the water. And when you buy a piece of property, I don't believe that's one of the things that needs to be disclosed. Now that you have this data, maybe if you're going to buy a place to live, you might want to check into whether where you're going to live might have arsenic in the water, or farm chemicals, or uranium. Yes, you can have uranium in water. So do you do your own testing when you learn about these things, or do you utilize the services of somebody who is experienced? Get a pre-sale EMF assessment from a qualified, and qualification doesn't come easy. There's no job title, there's no school to graduate from, there's no certification process that will guarantee a qualified EMF professional. But my encouragement would be get a pre-sale EMF assessment from a qualified local resource before you buy. So I have another podcast. Take a listen to that, because most of my audience is not in the area that I cover from a delivery of EMF remediation, EMF consulting perspective. I only drive so far. And so I happily keep my practice to the majestic inland Northwest. I do some telephone-based or Zoom-based consulting to help people in other areas as needed. I will even work with people to help them accrue the consulting skills needed if they want to become an EMF consultant themselves. But even given all that, my recommendation is a local resource, qualified local resource. It's kind of the support your local farmer concept. So I have a podcast all about how to find the best local EMF consultant in your area. You might like to take a look at that. It has kind of a unique distinction, I knew nothing about podcasting when I got into this maybe 9 months ago, but there are statistics that are available. They're not as good as on some other forms of media, but they're better than others. And one of the things that you can look at is when you put a podcast out, how many people listen to that podcast, download it, and then how much of the podcast they actually consume. Do they listen to the whole thing, or do they only listen to a portion of it? So it's quite normal to look at a podcast and see, oh, okay, so I had 89% retention, the people all aggregated together, the amount they listened on average, that was 89% of the content of that particular podcast. Or, one that doesn't do very well, maybe it's 20 or 30 or whatever percent. That podcast that I did on how to find the best qualified consultant in your local area had a consumption of greater than 100%, which is odd, right? How do you consume more than 100% of a podcast? And the answer is that on average, most people were listening to it more than once. Wild. Anyway, seems to be one that is popular. That's all I'm trying to say. And it's a gift, wherever you live, take a listen to that. I want to help you. I'm very jealous for the people who come to me for help or listen to this podcast. I want them to get the best help possible. So what I mentioned before is you want to find a place livable for today, but strategic for tomorrow. So let's get going with those 3 new examples. Okay, so when we're doing an evaluation of a blank piece of land, a land upon which you plan on building your home, or we're looking at an apartment or a condominium or a home that you're going to be renting, or perhaps a home that you're going to be purchasing, we look at 4 types of electromagnetic radiation. We look at electric fields, magnetic fields, and dirty electricity. Those 3 are all associated with the way that we distribute and consume electricity. And then there's a 4th, which is the 800-pound gorilla in the room, the one that doesn't get ignored. It is radio frequency radiation. It's the stuff of which we're building our modern society. It's like the Roman wine was sweet because it was flavored with lead, and lead is absolutely toxic to life. Well, we're building our future around radio frequency radiation. So that is the 4th factor that we take a look at. When we go into a home, we look at the high use areas in that home, and we pay particular attention, of course, to those high use areas. And the most important is where you're sleeping, where you're experiencing that sort of daily Sabbath, if you will, that regenerative time where you're recovering and you're healing from the assaults and insults of the day from a physiologic perspective. So that's how we prioritize. And then we actually measure with accurate equipment and techniques the levels of each of those 4 in each place that is a high-use area. And then we grade them. And the typical grading is, you have an ideal range of exposure, which is defined by levels from this number to that number, usually from 0 to whatever. And then you have a slight level exposure and an exposure range, a severe level exposure and a exposure range for that. and an extreme level and an exposure level for that. So ideal, slight, severe, and extreme. And if we color-coded those, I would choose green, yellow, red, and black. But because I work with other people who have been poisoned, who are being poisoned by harmful, man-made electromagnetic radiation, the name of this podcast is Reversing Electromagnetic Poisoning. So for those people who are experiencing today that electromagnetic poisoning, the ideal level of exposure might not be low enough. So what can we say about what is a safe exposure level? I get that question all the time. The only answer that I can give, what is a safe level, we know the safe level to man-made electromagnetic radiation is 0. 0 to the full ability of your most accurate instrument to measure, right? And the reason I say that is because if there is no man-made magnetic field, for example, there can't be a magnetic field effect. Anything above 0 calls into question whether even what we might consider to be a tiny level of exposure, it calls into question whether there can be an effect. So I would make this not 4, but 5, and I would call the number 1 level, maybe I would color code it white, and I would say this is a 0. The range of exposure on that one is 0.000, however accurate your meter is, to 0.000. You get the idea, right? And then the ideal, the green level, is going to be a bit above that, and the slight, and the severe, and the extreme. The point is, though, it is up to you to decide. Nobody else but you. You can buy a house with arsenic in the well water, right? You can buy a house downwind from a asphalt plant, carcinogenic, right? Nobody will stop you. Caveat emptor, buyer beware. It's up to you to decide what levels are appropriate for you and for your loved ones. So I mention all of this so that when I talk to you about these 3 different situations and I say a slight level of exposure or a severe level exposure or an extreme level exposure, you can understand where that fits in the overall context of what I'm proposing as a 5-level hierarchy from safe, 0, and only 0. By the way, maybe unattainable on the planet. I'm not sure. Maybe a deserted island somewhere could get you 0 in all categories. So, number 1, safe. Number 2 is ideal. 3 is slight level of exposure. 4 is a severe level exposure. 5 is the extreme. I would color code them white, green, yellow, red, and black. So let's take a look at the first example. And we need to set the stage. So a little background here. This is a story of a home evaluation in the South Hill of Spokane. And the buyers were interested in ascertaining what the EMF challenges were and what it might take to remediate those challenges. Obviously, to consider whether this would be a good place for the buyers to live. So we went in and we did a thorough assessment, and we looked at all the high use areas, and we looked at all the high use areas according to the criteria that I just mentioned to you. And I'll tell you, one of the things that was a surprise to me is that the RF levels, although they would be severe, really weren't in the extreme level, which I thought might have happened. But all things considered, being in a large city like this, I was surprised they were as low as they were. You know, the sensitive people out there are saying severe RF. I don't want to live there. No, I don't either. I just was curious that it was high. That could not higher than it was. But the real issue was there were these electrical lines along one side of the house, and the house was on a corner. And then those lines made a 90-degree turn at that corner, and they continued along another side of the house. Okay, so we have these electric lines going now two sides of the house, sort of wrapping around the house, if you can imagine that. And we didn't have to wonder exactly what they were for, because the height off the ground and the number of insulators told me immediately that these were not ordinary electric distribution lines. These were, in fact, transmission lines headed for an electric substation just across the road, maybe two to 300 feet away. So that's not a good finding. But you don't know until you test the actual levels where things are going to be. Now, with power lines, you're going to expect two things. You're going to expect elevated electric fields and elevated magnetic fields. There can be a cure for the elevated electric fields because you can put countermeasures in the home. And usually you can shield at least a bedroom so that you can sort of recover better at night, even though you're going to have higher exposures during the day. The magnetic fields, however, no chance. So the real question with this house was, the real critical issue was, what were the magnetic field levels of exposure coming from these transmission lines, nearby distribution lines coming out of the electric substation, and the substation itself. And boy, we took a look and we measured, and they were in the severe range of exposure, severe magnetic fields. And the thing about that type of magnetic field exposure, that level of ambient magnetic fields, they can't be shielded. No way to shield those types of magnetic fields. So that's pretty much done, you know. Now, the magnetic field levels will vary over time in a residence. That's because the more power that's being used, the more magnetic field intensity. The less power that's being used, the smaller the magnetic field intensity. So we did our evaluation at a time of day when neither heating nor cooling would have been necessary. I would have wanted to do a 24-hour at least recording of the exposure of magnetic fields if the clients were interested in that, ascertaining how high could the magnetic fields potentially get. But when you're already looking at a severe level of exposure for a house that you're not, anyway, it makes no sense. So that's my first example. That is a uninhabitable. Now it's up to the clients to make that determination, not me. I don't stamp something uninhabitable. I just report in the different areas. So in the magnetic field areas, I reported severe level exposure, wrote down what the numbers were, mentioned that there's no way to remediate this particular EMF hazard. And it is, by the way, the only one like that can't be remediated. So I consider it to be the most important thing to look at first, even though RF gets all the attention. In this case, for these buyers, this was uninhabitable land. Doesn't mean you can't go buy it. Doesn't mean you can't move in and try to live there. Nobody will stop you. Caveat emptor, it is for you to make that decision and you alone. So let's take a look at our next example. So this one is a dear client and a friend who has been sensitive for a number of years and knew that she required a place to live with ideal EMF parameters. And I want to describe how beautiful this place was. It was majestic. It was at the top of a hill, what we'll call a hill here in the county in which we live. It would be called a mountain in other parts of the country or in other parts of the world. And the view was just spectacular. You could see portions of 3 different counties, and these are large counties. You could see for a very long way, and because of the topography of the ground, the nearest, you had one neighbor to be concerned about, but that neighbor was hundreds of yards away. And after that, nobody was really close by. So I'm not a fan of high places in general for EMF strategic living, because whatever you can see, the same can see you. And what I mean by that is, with regard to RF radiation in particular, if you can see a distant city, then according to the inverse square law, the intensity of each of those RF radiation sources decreases dramatically over a distance, so it's not much by the time it gets to you, but it never goes to zero. So you've got all that complexity, just all of that residual adding up to be a sort of a low murmur in the background. And you might decide that's fine for you, and that's great if you want to make that decision. The problem was that the owner took a look at this place and said, "This is perfect." And it looked perfect. Such a beautiful, beautiful place. A nice clearing, no real concern for fire because there was a big fire break and meadow, and then just this commanding view, and then the forest nearby. Really, really spectacular. What they didn't know about, because they weren't local to the area, was radar in this area. And the first time I visited, I'm looking at this panoramic view, and I can see the mountain upon which there is a long distance type of radar, and I just thought, oh no. So the house had magnetic fields that were fine. They were in the ideal range. It had electric fields that were high because it had standard wiring, but you could potentially live with that by shielding the bedroom where you're going to be recovering. Dirty electricity was off the charts because this particular electric utility, uses dirty electricity technology to power their smart meters. They don't use RF. They use dirty electricity. That's a whole nother topic in itself. So those two weren't great, but the killer was really the RF exposure to radar, and it was in the severe range. Can you imagine? You're going from the not ideal, but the slight level of exposure. You're less than 5 microwatts per square meter. And that's doable depending on your level of sensitivity. It depends on the individual. But that may be doable, not the periodic sweeps into the severe range every few seconds from the radar. Really heartbreaking, really heartbreaking. And, it's for this individual to decide, but the reason she was contacting me was she knew something wasn't right. She just didn't know what it was. And they had bought this house without having an EMF assessment done, even though she was sensitive. And the reason is nobody would look at this and think it's a bad place. It was, as I say, it was just beautiful, majestic, plenty of land, no close by neighbors. It had a lot of the good characteristics that you would look for a strategic home, but didn't know about this. And yeah, so she's made the difficult decision. Now, radar, you can, the house, the front of the house is covered with glass. So, we can do something about that. We can minimize what penetrates the glass. You can never eliminate 100% of it. And then this type of radar penetrates the entire structure. So goes through the building materials like they weren't there. And that means you'd have to do the entire front of the house. And even with a thorough job of that, there would be so much residual that would come through, there wouldn't be any guarantee we would be anywhere near a level of exposure that she would be happy with. Heartbreaking, unexpected for her. I think most people would look at this beautiful, isolated place and think it's just going to be perfect. I've been doing this long enough to know buying a house in the country isn't enough. You have to make sure it's not going to be a problem. So unfortunately, fortunately now she knows what the problem is, that it can't be adequately remediated to meet her specific needs. And I think she's going to make the decision that she needs to move and find another place. Okay, the last example that I want to share with you is actually not a place where there was a home at all, or even a home being built, but it was an idyllic place that I wanted to escape to. And I'll tell you a little bit of the backstory. I was chosen to be a beta tester for the new Safe Living millimeter wave RF meter so that we can get our first accurate view of what's going on the millimeter wave spectrum. And all of our mindset had been around millimeter wave equals 5G high band. Millimeter wave equals 5G high band. As I was testing this meter and traveling to different places in Kootenai County and within Bonner County, and I've yet to take it into Spokane, but I hope to do that soon, I discovered some really bad news. I thought the fact that we were a, rather rugged terrain, not that much population and lots of land, I figured we'd be spared from the horrors of high band 5G and therefore the millimeter wave exposure that would come with it. And indeed, I don't believe we have, I can't say everywhere because I haven't tested every square meter, but I have yet to find any evidence of 5G high band, the millimeter wave stuff, which is excellent. What I have found is that there's copious amounts of millimeter wave radiation unexpected in the environment. I did one podcast on the first component, which is that you can't buy food in this county without, with one small exception, exposing yourself to millimeter wave radiation. And I still have more to report, I'll leave that for another time. I have more to report, and it's not great news and involves millimeter wave radiation. So I had gone out one day, and I was putting together information I planned on sharing with Safe Living, and I was testing the local environments for millimeter wave exposures. And I tell you what, I just reached a point where I kind of had enough, and I needed a break. So I thought, I'm going to take, because I had my camera gear with me, and I'm going to go to a place that's very special to me. It is east of Sandpoint by really just a short distance. I don't know if it's 20 minutes or 25 minutes to get to this spot. And it's renowned for picking huckleberries, which is why, I can't tell you where it is. Otherwise, I'll suffer the fate of people who share their huckleberry picking spots. And there is a stream or a creek that runs through it. And so it's a heavily forested area with this beautiful trickling stream. And I got to tell you, I'm a real sucker. I get drawn towards water. The ocean is the ultimate. A pond, wonderful. A lake, wonderful. But moving water? Oh, give me a river, stream, creek, and I just love it. So, and I've talked to you about finding a pristine place to do some earthing. And I thought, maybe I'll just disappear over to this place. I haven't been there in a while. I have all of my instrumentation. I'd like to check it out because I've never actually measured. So I'd like to confirm it's a wonderful place. And I want to take some pictures. I have to try to remember to put the cover art on this podcast episode. Maybe I can share one of the images that I took that day. So the area that I went to is actually, I think it's a state park or forest land or something. Anyway, it isn't a place where you could build a house. It looks like a place that you would really want to build a house. And let me see if I can get some mood. Yeah, there we go. This is what it sounded like. So, wonderful day, not too hot, not too cool. Down by this stream, I'm taking pictures. I'm observing what local wildlife is there and listening to the birds. And I was happy with some of the images that I got. And as often happens when I'm out photographing, I just sort of lost myself for a while. Time went by and I thought, oh boy, I better start getting home. Let me take some measurements before I leave. I had already, when I first got there, I'd already checked out the RF. And it was a disappointment, of course, because many people want what they call cell phone service. They want to have cell phone service. I view it a little differently, and maybe you do too. If there's cell phone service, it means that you're being continuously bombarded with RF radiation. So to be in this beautiful place and learn that I was indeed being bombarded by RF radiation, although I will say at what you might consider to be a modest level on the scale that we talked about, it would be a slight exposure, not an ideal exposure, slight exposure. And it was around 5 microwatts per square meter. But I find for me personally, I can endure that. I can endure that. I can even have productive earthing in a place like that. I built my shielded home in an environment that had that kind of RF exposure. And then the shielding that you put in really does bring you to an ideal, even depending on the sensitivity of your meter, even to 0 or 0.000. So I can bear. I wish it wasn't that way. I wish we didn't have that environmental RF exposure, but I can endure that. So then I got out my other instruments and I checked, and electric fields were 0.0, and I thought, well, seems reasonable. I can't see any power lines anywhere around me. And you almost want sometimes to not even bother checking the magnetic, but I always check. I always check because you can be humbled. And I'm glad I did check, because not only did we have some residual magnetic fields there, we had severe magnetic fields. In this environment, severe magnetic fields. I'll tell you what, of all the types of EMF, magnetic fields are no joke. We talked in an earlier example about how they can't be remediated. Not the ambient type of magnetic field like this, they can't. And here, this level was in the severe range of exposure. So even if you built a home there and you shielded it for RF and you weren't on the grid at all, you would have 0.0 electric field exposure. You would have an ideal level in the house anyway of RF exposure, but you couldn't do a thing about the magnetic field exposure. So what is the takeaway here? The takeaway here is you can't tell by looks. Looks can be deceiving, and it is up to you to decide what acceptable levels of exposure are for you and for your loved ones. And in case you're wondering, what we call an ideal level of exposure is maybe 1 trillion times higher than normal background radiation. Do you realize that? And the man-made electromagnetic radiation didn't exist 200 years ago. I'm not even sure if the place, the city of Sandpoint, for example, I'm not even sure they had electricity, which would have brought the electric and magnetic fields 100 years ago. I don't know if they had it 100 years ago. If they did, they probably hadn't had it for very long. 150 years ago, nobody had electric power in their homes. So all of these things that we're looking at, electric fields, magnetic fields, the dirty electricity that propagates on the electric lines, and the radio frequency radiation, they're all new. And as we've talked about before, in Samuel Milham's book, he was a medical doctor and epidemiologist. His work correlated the spread of just the electric grid itself to an increase in all the diseases of modern civilization. So we look at the ideal, slight, severe, extreme ranges, and it's important to know that those levels are many, many, many times higher. Any electric field, any alternating current magnetic field, and I should have said any alternating current electric field as well, because there certainly is a natural direct current magnetic field and electric field that we're meant to live in, but none of the alternating current stuff, and certainly none of the radio frequency polarized radiation that we have today. So for you to decide, if you do nothing, the levels are going to increase, and 10 years from now, the levels will be high everywhere, or most places, and people will be saying, well, I don't see a problem. It's no higher than it is in whatever, fill in the name of a local city or whatever. So I would suggest you decide now what are the acceptable levels for you and for your loved ones, and introduce this idea that something that looks very beautiful can have arsenic in the water, right? That was my example here today. And someplace that looks very beautiful, even in the city, even in the country, and you came from a big city, someplace that looks very beautiful can actually be uninhabitable from an EMF perspective if EMF exposure is important to you. All right, so I hope this discussion about uninhabitable places and the examples that we've looked at have helped to shine a light on this idea of considering carefully, are you in a habitable place? Because if you don't think about this, 5 years from now, it's going to be less habitable. And when are you going to get the clue? Who's going to send you the memo? Who's going to send you the memo on that? Up to you. Take action. Make a plan. Find a place. Find that wrinkle in the earth. That's my encouragement to you. Maybe consider building a house with some lasting countermeasures in place. Develop a relationship with somebody that you can trust in this whole realm of EMF assessment, remediation, construction. That's my encouragement. So I hope this has been helpful to you. And if you would like to become a supporter of the podcast, we would be grateful for your help. There is a link in the description if you would like to do that. If you would be willing, pray for us. Pray for us in our efforts with this podcast and what we do with our EMF remedy consulting practice. The prayer would be that we would be able to help many people with this new environmental toxin. And lastly, would you consider doing a review if you're on, a review on the podcast platform that you're using, and if you're listening to this on YouTube, a comment would help. So this has been Keith Cutter with EMFremedy.com. I'm really looking forward to next time. We'll see you then.